All right, 93, 93, 93. This is the Mon Ashrenew from ashrenew.com. You already know who it is. Today we will speak on Halloween and the Day of the Dead. Who should be honored? All right. The short answer is you should honor anyone that you want to work with personally, anyone that you want to visit you in your dreams, because this is how the dead communicates, right? They're not going to communicate with you in, you can say, in the living world or the land of the living. They will communicate in the dream plane or in the astral plane. So whoever you decide personally that you would like to work with, that you would like to gain wisdom from, should be the person or the people that you honor and that you celebrate, other than your personal ancestors, of course. Now, when it comes to Halloween, as we know, Halloween, people dress up in costumes, looking like the dead, looking like zombies, looking like skeletons, ghouls, goblins, all of these underworld beings, right? So we dress up, we celebrate, especially kids. You give the kids candy because the spirits, feed on the candy, the sugar, the sweets, also the spices, so on and so forth, right? Because this is when the gates are the thinnest between the land of the living and the land of the dead. So we're going through the transition, once we make it to October and once we go into November, we are going through the transition where the veils are the thinnest, so it will be a lot easier to work with these energies, right? So just the whole month of October, the veils become thinner and thinner and thinner as we approach Halloween. So the whole month of October, you essentially, this is the time to work with, again, those who you honor, those who you respect, whether it's personal or someone you have not met at all, somebody who you wish to meet, because everyone is essentially still living. You have the ability to communicate with the shadows or the shades of those who have once walked the earth. And this is essentially why we celebrate the ancestors in the first place. Greetings, greetings. What's up, Safi? I'll just call you Safi. Safiya, if I'm saying your name correctly. So this is what we do for the dead, because we should not grieve the dead. When people die, when people make their transition, the reason why we celebrate is because we want to give them the best energy that we can give them. Because when we're sad and when we're upset and when we're crying and when we're grieving, that's not necessarily the best energy to give to those who have departed, because they have to make their journey to the stars. So we want to do our best to be in high spirits. We want to do our best to, give them the best of ourselves instead of the worst or the lowest of ourselves. So we want to do our best to give them our highest attributes versus our lowest attributes. So we have been taught to grieve the dead, because the further you go back in history, you know that death was to be celebrated. And there are still cultures, especially cultures in Mexico and, Central America, Southern America. These cultures actually honor the dead. That's why you have deities like La Santissima, Muerte, El Cristo Negro, you know. You have these deities that are the lords of the underworld. You celebrate the dead by putting money on La Santissima Muerte. Right? So we're doing all these things to honor the dead. So the reason why you put money on, you could say, a skeleton with Lady Death or Saint Death, because she goes by many names. You cover her with money because that's just another way of honoring the dead. Giving them, your hard-earned money, giving them the best of you. Because, pretty much for a lot of people, the best of them is their personal resources, right? People bust their ass and people make the ultimate sacrifices for the dollar bill. So you actually giving the dollar bill, and we're not talking about ancestor money, because you have, the ancestor money or what is called hell money, but then you have the actual money. So when you look at La Santissima Morte, she's not covered in ancestor money, she's covered in actual dollars. Or, fives, tens, 20s, hundreds, whatever it may be. So she's covered in real money. So just to make that distinction so that there is no confusion. So again, this is just the time to prepare for the season of death, because the veils will become more thinner and thinner and thinner. And this is the perfect opportunity to communicate with those who you always wanted to communicate with, those you may not have seen for a while, your grandparents, your mothers, your fathers, those who have made the transition, gain that communication, because especially those who have been on the other side for quite some time, again, we continue to live. We don't just die. So they continue to gain wisdom. So because they continue to gain wisdom, they can always depart wisdom to you that you may not have known, or things that they may not have known while they were here. So of course they are not limited to the time that they actually departed. Spirits continue to grow, spirits continue to evolve. As again, there is no time, there is no beginning, there is no ending. Time is just a illusion or a fabrication of what we think it is. But in reality, again, time is infinite, so there is no stopping point, when it comes to wisdom, and that's what makes wisdom infinite. So even when we say, the ancestors were wise, again, there really has no beginning. So you could say even the so-called first people were already wise. So before we even had any experience on the planet Earth, you said the first people to inhabit the planet Earth, these people were already wise. Because, you can say they had wisdom going back to the planet Mars. You can say before we was on planet Earth, we was on Mars. And before we was on Mars, we were elsewhere. Before that is elsewhere. So we just bring this universal wisdom with us that, we call it karma, right? Because as we know, all karma is not bad karma. We also have a thing called good karma. Good karma would be considered wisdom, ancestral wisdom, wisdom that is older than even, the people that you see or even the people that you've known, going back generations, 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 generations. So this is essentially what you want to tap into. You're tapping into ancestral wisdom or universal wisdom that goes back to the very essence of who and what we are, which is basically stardust. So really you're getting the wisdom of the stars, which is the whole science of astrology, which is a whole science of astronomy. So you're getting that star intelligence, which is really our goal in the first place. And again, that's why we do our best to acquaint ourselves with the occult, which ultimately is just ancestral wisdom going back to star intelligence, being able to communicate with the stars directly, because we are the stars. We are all living stars. We are all resurrected star dust. We come from the dead and now we are living, right? A star had to die in order for you to be born. And we know when a star dies, it multiplies itself. And as it multiplies itself, it emits carbon, and that carbon descends to the planet. And of course, that carbon holds intelligence from that particular star. So the intelligence that we call carbon, which is the basis of the physical world, if you remove carbon, there is no physical plane, there is no physical world. So if carbon all comes from dead stars, we know that those dead stars hold infinite intelligence. That wisdom does not die because a star actually died. The wisdom continues on in the form of what we call human beings. And what do human beings do? Human beings multiply, just like stars multiply when they die. So that intelligence is carried on, and it continues to go, continue to go, continue to go, and it never stops, and it never will stop. So even if we decide to inhabit another planet, because that's what people are talking about now. People are talking about inhabiting the moon. People are talking about inhabiting Mars. So wherever we decide to go, wherever we decide to inhabit, that star intelligence remains within us in the form of, as we say, our natal chart. So essentially, all these secrets are hidden within the natal chart. It's not obvious. So this is going beyond your sun sign, your moon sign, your ascendant. It's going beyond the obvious because that's why we have all type of points in the natal chart. So we have the planets, but also you have the mini planets that we call the asteroids, right? So not only do you have the asteroids, you have the muses, you have the centaurs, you have the fixed stars. Again, when we go into the science of astrology, it's deeper than most people realize because we only want to stick to the surface. But the only reason we stick to the surface because that is the mainstream version of astrology, dealing with horoscopes and sun signs. So they have reduced it, to make it essentially so the masses can understand it. But it was never meant to be dumbed down because you really can't get too much from that. How much are you really getting because you know your sun sign? How much are you really getting, because you know the absolute basics? That gives you a sense of who you are. Like when you know your sun sign, when you know your attributes, that gives you a sense of who you are. That gives you a sense of you can say your archetype. So knowing your sun sign gives you a sense of your archetype. But in terms of when we talk about destiny, when we talk about fate, when we talk about, as they call, hidden talents and the secrets of your chart, you have to go into the hidden attributes or the secret attributes that most people don't even talk about because it wasn't never meant for them to talk about because you see, you have to go deeper, which is the goal if you are an astrologer, right? What's up, Zen? Gemini Sun. So if we're talking about the sun sign again, this gives you an essence of your archetype, which, is a step in the right direction. Because once you understand your archetype, now you know essentially how you should navigate your creativity. Because that's essentially what your sun sign is. Because your sun sign is not your personality. That's one of the greatest misconceptions of astrology. Because when we think about our sun signs, we may think, okay, that's how I am. Your personality is more connected to your ascendant, right? So knowing what your ascendant is more telling of what your personality is. So when it comes to your sun sign, that's more about your personal power. That's more so how you see yourself. That's not how others see you. Others see your ascendant. So whatever your ascendant is, that's how you communicate with the world around you. That's how you communicate with your environment. Exactly, Libra ascendant. So the world will see you as a Libra. The world does not see you as a Gemini. You see yourself as a Gemini because you have the internal sight. So your sun sign is more personal than we have been made to believe. So we communicate with others. We communicate with our environment. We do all that through the ascendant because your ascendant represents your persona, right? So your sun sign is more personal. Your sun sign is more about how you see your own creativity and how you express yourself. Again, which is more personal. So you can say the sun sign is more personal. It's the ascendant that helps you to interact with the world, right? Then if we talk about your moon sign, your moon sign actually is, you can say, even more important than your sun sign. The reason why your moon sign is more important than your sun sign because your sun sign is like your overall creativity, your overall personal power, like in a bigger sense, right? If you were to scale yourself in the greatest sense. So when people say, you have to think big, that thinking big is like tapping into your sun sign. But when you think smaller, that's your moon sign. Your moon sign is more so you dealing with yourself on a day-to-day basis because that's basically what represents or what controls your emotional plane or your emotions, as we call the subconscious. So if you really want to know who you are more so on a day-to-day basis versus a year-to-year basis, that is your moon sign. That's why you have a lunar return every month, but you only have a solar return once a year. So for every one solar return that we call our birthday, You have 12 lunar returns, which is every month, because the moon moves a lot faster than the sun. The moon goes through all 12 zodiac signs in 30 days. The sun goes through all 12 zodiac signs in 365 days. So you see it's over 10 times difference. So the moon is moving over 10 times faster than the sun. So again, if you want to know who you are on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, on a year, not the year-to-year, a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, and a month-to-month basis, that's more so your moon sign. But in terms of your yearly changes or your seasonal changes, that's more so the sun sign. Your sun sign gives you a sense of your seasonal changes and your yearly changes. But again, your daily changes, your weekly changes, and your monthly changes is based upon your moon sign. So you looking at your moon sign will give you a better perspective of what you have to deal with personally on a day-to-day basis. Versus your sun sign is more, your seasonal changes, right? And again, so that's why that represents the Holy Trinity, your sun sign, your moon sign, and your ascendant, right? So just knowing that gives you a basis of essentially who and what you are. So if you understand yourself on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, and then the yearly basis, then you understand how you interact with your environment and other people. That represents your Holy Trinity, your sun, your moon, and your ascendant. But of course, we know that we have other planets. We also have to consider Mercury. We have to consider Venus. We have to consider Mars. We have to consider Jupiter. We have to consider Saturn. We have to consider Uranus. We have to consider Neptune. And we have to consider Pluto. Just like we have to consider Rahu and we have to consider Ketu, otherwise known as the North Node and the South Node. So you see there's essentially a total of 10 points. So even if you know your Holy Trinity, that's only 3 out of 10 points for you to consider, right? If there is a descendant, isn't there an ascendant? Yes. Your descendant is your 7th house cusp. Your ascendant is your 1st house cusp. So yes, which is the opposite. So your descendant is the opposite of your ascendant. So if you have an ascendant Aries, your descendant would be Libra, because it's exactly the opposite of Aries. All right, so you have your ascendant and you have your descendant. Your descendant is more about how you interact with people on a one-to-one basis. So you can say your ascendant is your persona. That's basically the mask you put on for the world. How other people see you. It's the mask that other people see. That's your persona. That's your ascendant. Then when we deal with the descendant, that's more so when you engage in one-to-one communications. Just like you have your ascendant, you have your descendant, you have your nadir, then you have your midheaven. Your nadir is your 4th house cusp, and your midheaven is your 10th house cusp. Your midheaven is your public persona. So you have your persona, you have your one-on-one interactions, which is your descendant. Your midheaven represents your public persona, which also represents your career and how you engage with the public. Basically your world stage, how you engage the world stage, that represents your midheaven. Then you have your nadir, right? Your nadir is your connection with, you can say, God, your spiritual connection, right? So you have your persona, your one-on-one interactions, how you interact on the world stage, and how you interact spiritually or internally, right? So do area codes work? Yes, that is locational astrology. Locational astrology gives you insight as to where your actual location is and how you interact with your city environment, right? So that's a whole different science of astrology. That's called locational astrology. So that lets you know what planets are dominant based on the location that you're in. So basically, if you are in New York, different planets will be dominant versus if you are in Los Angeles, versus if you're in Texas, versus if you're in Michigan, versus if you're in Europe, versus if you're in South America. So yes, your location matters. That's the whole science of locational astrology. Again, that's a little bit more advanced. The average person is not going that deep, but we see astrology goes as deep as you want it to go, because there are four main schools of astrology. The four main schools, of course, the first one is natal astrology, which represents personal astrology. Then you have political astrology, which is astrology going on the world stage. Then you have electional astrology. Electional astrology lets you know when is the appropriate time to do certain things. Like when is the appropriate time to start a business? When is the appropriate time to, you can say, look for relationships or look for business partnerships? Everything is about timing. So this is called electional astrology. So you can get your timing on point, right? Because everything has a season, everything has a time. So you want to make sure that you plan your timing accordingly. You are strategic in when you plan on doing things, right? Then you have the fourth school of astrology, which is called honorary astrology. Honorary astrology is basically your ability to answer yes or no questions, based on what's going on currently. So we see astrology is mostly calculations and mathematics. But for people, okay, well, should I do this now or should I not do this? You're able to look at the current charts and the current planets and, come to a yes or no answer. So that's a whole separate school of astrology because they do that more so in the East. Once you start studying Vedic astrology, they're more so into electional astrology and they're more into the honorary astrology. So those two schools are more for the Eastern people because they use that more daily. Once we make it over here to the West, we're just more so into the natal astrology and then the political astrology. So that's pretty much as far as we go over here on the West. But again, you also have different schools like locational astrology, as I said. You also have medical astrology, which is how you should navigate your diet. So your diet should be based on your sun sign. Your diet should not be based on what's healthy and what's not healthy, right? So again, but that's a whole different school of astrology. So essentially, astrology takes you as deep as you want it to go versus it just being about horoscopes, which you can say is a whole nother form of astrology. So most people are just into, their sun sign and horoscopes, and they're not going any deeper than that. But again, that's for the mainstream. Once you begin to peel back the layers, you realize, oh, astrology is a lot deeper than you realize. Then you get into things like lunar mansions, which are 27 in number. See, when we here in the West, we only deal with 12 houses. When you go to the East, they deal with 27 houses, right? So you're dealing with more than double of the houses. So you see, it gets more advanced, it gets more complex, and so it's based on how much can you handle versus it just being simplified for the mainstream. So the mainstream will always deal with the simplified astrology, but as you continue to make your journey through the occult, you will realize that all of these factors matter and they play a part. So again, if you want to understand what's going on the world stage or what's going on with politics, there's a whole school of astrology for that. So you don't have to wait for the media. You don't have to wait for the news. You don't have to wait for these politicians to, make speeches and all that. There's a whole school of astrology that's dictated strictly towards dealing with the world stage. But again, that's less popular. Most people are just into the personal astrology because, people want to know what's going on in their lives. They want to know, what's going on with their finances, with their love life, so on and so forth. So most people just deal with the personalization of astrology called natal astrology. So the average person don't go any further than that unless you have a genuine interest in astrology. So again, most people is not going to go no further than that unless you have a genuine interest. If you really want to see how deep the rabbit hole goes, then you start discovering these other factors. Then you go into Vedic astrology, Chinese astrology. Then you even go into Draconic astrology. Draconic astrology is more like karmic astrology. If you want to know how to cleanse your karma, if you want to know how to dissolve your karma, because that changes your sign. Because, for example, if you are a Scorpio Western, if you study Vedic astrology, you are a Libra. But if you study Draconic astrology, you become a Capricorn. So you see how that completely changes your perspective of who you think you are, because it's based on perception. It all depends on what lens do you want to see your life through. How do you want to perceive yourself? So some people prefer Western astrology, some people prefer Vedic astrology, then other people prefer Draconic astrology because it makes more sense to them. So essentially, it's like it tells you the missing factors. That's essentially my personal perspective of Draconic astrology, because your Draconic sign would be the opposite of your, not the exact opposite, it would be the opposite element. So if you are a water sign, for example, your Draconic sign would be earth. If you are a fire sign, your Draconic sign would be wind. It would be your opposite element. So essentially, people that are very watery, what helps the water to ground itself is the earth. So your Draconic sign will reflect the earth. So it gives you insight as to how to ground your waters if you are the waters. If you are earth, your Draconic sign would be the waters. So, the earth people, you can say, tend to be very stable, stabilized, very stiff. So in order to, you can say, become more flexible, you start dwelling into the waters. So it makes you a lot more flexible so that you're not so, headstrong about things. If you are a fire sign, then it takes you to the air. So now you can expand your fire instead of your fire being concentrated. Now you can navigate it. And if you are already an air sign, it takes you to the world of the fire. So now your airs are not so thin and windy. Now you're able to heat up your temperatures, again, which allows you to make vapors. Because when the fire mixes with the air, you're able to, it's a whole difference between like getting in a bathtub, well, not a bathtub, like a jacuzzi versus a pool. Like, if you get into a pool, the water is cold. So you basically gotta just hop in instantly, for your body to adjust. But if you're getting into a jacuzzi with that heat, it's a whole different experience. You're able to go in real slowly and relax into the water versus having to just completely just dive in there and just make the adjustments like that. So again, astrology goes as deep as you want it to go, depending on, your love for it. You're only going to go as deep as your love requires, because again, it requires some time to be able to comprehend these things. Even though we have technology, so you can access these things on your cell phone, you can access these things on your computers and laptops, but you still have to be able to decode the symbolism. And that's why people, they have astrologers to decode the symbolism, because it is a language. You can say the symbolisms of astrology represents an entire language. It's not just symbols, it represents a language, and that language communicates messages. That's why you can have two different astrologers and they can come to two different conclusions, because it's based on what you know. So let's just say an astrologer that's just strictly Western, if you ask them to decode something Eastern, they may have a hard time doing it, even though it's the same symbolisms. But it's painting a whole different type of picture. And that different picture, will lead you to different conclusions. So for example, if you grew up, thinking that you are a Scorpio, right, because you have studied the Western astrology, then you start studying Vedic astrology, you start studying Vedic astrology, and it comes to find out that you're a Libra. It's not that you're not a Scorpio. You're just looking at things from a different perspective. You're looking at things from a different lens. So when you look at yourself from the lens of a Libra, and you have been looking at yourself as a Scorpio, it changes things for you. You're like, yo, I resonate with the Scorpio. Now how all of a sudden am I a Libra? Or if you are a Capricorn, now all of a sudden you're a Sagittarius. If you're a Taurus, now all of a sudden you're an Aries. So a lot of people, it takes some time to make that adjustment to be able to see yourself from a different perspective. But again, astrology allows you to see yourself in multiple dimensions. That's what makes it so powerful, because you realize that you are not one-dimensional. You realize that this is what makes you a multi-dimensional being, because you're able to see yourself in different lenses. And you may resonate more so with a different lens than what you have been used to hearing. So you could say everybody essentially knows what their sun sign is, from a Western perspective, if you have even the slightest interest of astrology. So even a person that has the slightest interest at least knows what their sun sign is. So once you start digging into the Chinese astrology, the Vedic astrology, the Draconic astrology, and whichever systems that you choose to utilize, This allows you to see yourself through an entirely new lens. So you begin to see, you can say, the hidden attributes, because certain lenses may emphasize certain points and certain attributes that the other chart does not emphasize. And this is essentially how you discover, you can say, your hidden talents and things that may be more mysterious to you. It may not be as obvious to you. You may have to look at yourself through a different lens for certain attributes to stand out. So that's how you begin to discover, the fullness of yourself, because you're looking at yourself through multiple lenses, which will highlight different factors. So because these different lenses highlight different factors, you're able to, again, essentially look at yourself holistically. And when you see yourself holistically, when you see yourself holistically, this is how you discover who and what you really are, as we call our true self, or our divine will, or our thelema, because you're able to see yourself fully. You're able to utilize all 360 degrees of your chart. And you're looking at all your aspects, the relationships that the planets have with each other, which changes. Your Western chart, the relationships between the planets change when you look at your Vedic chart, which then change again when you look at your Draconic chart, so on and so forth. So you can say your sun and your moon may get along in your Western chart, but they may not get along in your Vedic chart. And they may get along even better in your Draconic chart. So you're able to look at all these multiple dimensions and say, like, okay, I see where that's real. I see where that's real. Like, in my personal perspective, I see that the Western astrology tells you the obvious. What I mean by that is, you can say, if you are an introvert, if you see yourself as an introvert, you can say your Western natal chart will essentially just confirm that. It basically confirms the obvious. So if you like to paint, for example, your Western chart will, like, okay, you have the chart of a painter, for example. So it tells you the obvious. It tells you essentially what's on the surface. So your Western chart tells you exactly, essentially, what's right in front of you, which is useful. So, like, when you want to know information that's on the surface, that's right in front of you, if you want to know exactly what your eyes are looking at, then the Western astrology is good for that. When you want to peel back the layers, when you want to know what's going on internally, then that's when a Vedic astrology becomes a factor. When you want to dig a little deeper, like, okay, I see what my eyes see, but what are my eyes missing? So when you want to know what your eyes are missing, then you begin to discover the Vedic astrology, so that you can see beyond the surface. Then when you want to know, okay, what is the missing factor? How do I balance myself? What is my counterbalance? How do I become whole? Again, how do I tap into my opposite element? Then you go into the Draconic astrology. So again, if you are water, it shows you how to ground yourself and be balanced with the earth element, so on and so forth. So every lens, every factor, every perspective has its use. So once you become familiar with the uses, on the multiple uses, you begin to know what to use depending on what you're looking for. So you see, you have many different tools and many different factors to choose from, and you're able to essentially go directly to the source of what you're seeking, versus trying to do everything through Western astrology, or trying to do everything through Vedic, or trying to do everything through Draconic. We must use all of these factors simultaneously so that we can see the full picture. So that's why I always encourage, you want to see yourself in a multi-dimensional light. And you also want to see the world from a multi-dimensional light. So for example, we know on the world stage, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going on with the war. We don't know what may happen tomorrow. However, if you wanted to know, okay, well, what is the hidden factor behind all of these world events and all of these politics? Then you will have to go into the Vedic. If you want to know what you're not seeing, we already know what we see right in front of us. So if you want to better understand what you see right in front of you, that's what the Western is for. But if you want to see, okay, what factor is hidden, then you go into the Vedic. Then, okay, but what is the counterbalance to what's going on? Then you go into the Draconic. You see how all these things work? So I'm just giving you insight as to how all these factors work together, and there's no need to separate it. We're just so used to separating things. We separate math from science, from language, from this, from that. The whole purpose of the occult is to bring all of these factors together in unity so that you know how to decode essentially any person, place, or thing that you wish to decode, and you start with yourself. 'Cause once you're able to essentially read your Holy Bible and read your Holy Quran, which is yourself, knowing yourself, then there's nothing that the world or the universe can hide from you because you have revealed everything with yourself first. So once you're able to clarify it with yourself and within your own self, the universe just becomes an open book. The world becomes an open book. The people become an open book once you open up your own secrets and your own factors because you see yourself as a multidimensional being. That means everything is multidimensional, which is more realistic than looking at everything from a linear lens, which is what we have been taught. So we must break those spells of a linear view, and we look at ourselves more circular. In reality, it's more of a spiral. The planet's spiral instead of moving in a circle. So we understand the great spiral that we call the golden ratio. And life is based upon that golden ratio. And we see that all throughout these occult sciences. So this is just a little motivation, a little inspiration to dig deeper. Everything you thought you know, use that and combine it with new factors that may have been more mysterious to you. And with that, I bear peace. 93, 93, 93.